My own son pointed at my suitcase in the middle of the airport and yelled, "You're an embarrassment." Strangers laughed until security approached and the smile drained from his face. Hello, my name is Martha Green. I'm 74 years old and this is my story. Before I begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please share it in the comments. I always find it heartwarming to see how far stories like mine can travel. Now let me take you back to that day. It started as a family trip. My son, David, had invited me to join him, his wife Caroline, and their 2 children on a holiday abroad. I was hesitant at first. I've grown used to the quiet routine of my own home. But he insisted, "Mom, the kids hardly know you. This will be good for everyone." That was his reasoning. So I packed my things. I didn't have much, just clothes, a shawl my husband had given me, and my faithful old leather suitcase. That suitcase had been with me for more than 4 decades. My late husband, Walter, bought it for me before our honeymoon. Back then, leather was sturdy, and this piece was built to last. Over the years, its edges had softened. The brass clasps dulled, but it carried memories that no modern suitcase could ever replace. Every scratch told a story. Our first trip to the mountains, the time we rushed through a storm to catch a train, the weekends Walter and I spent visiting family. It was more than luggage. To me, it was history. But to David, it was an embarrassment. The moment we reached the airport, his face twisted in visible disgust. He didn't even lower his voice. "Mom, really? That old thing? Look at it. It's falling apart. Everyone's going to stare at us." I froze. People around us turned their heads, some raising eyebrows, others letting out small chuckles. Caroline smirked and whispered something to him, and he laughed louder as though my pain was entertainment. Even the children joined in, giggling as if mocking me was some sort of family game. I clutched the handle tighter, feeling the familiar grooves of the worn leather against my palm. I wanted to disappear into the floor, but instead of defending me, instead of respecting me, my own son had made me the butt of a public joke. It wasn't the first time either. Over the years, I'd endured countless small humiliations. David would roll his eyes at the way I dressed, telling me my cardigans were grandma relics. He once introduced me to his friends as the antique collector, except the antique is her wardrobe. At Christmas, when his in-laws visited, I was given the smallest corner room while his wife's parents stayed in the master suite. My birthday passed with barely a mention, but Caroline's mother received a party with balloons and speeches. Each slight stung, but I swallowed my pride. After all, he was my son. But that day at the airport, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, the sting of humiliation felt sharper than ever. Something about the way strangers were laughing at me, the way my son puffed his chest as if my shame elevated him, made my heart sink. I realized then that what hurt most wasn't the mockery. It was that David didn't see me anymore, not as a mother, not as a woman who had sacrificed so much for him. To him, I was just baggage. I whispered quietly, "It's just a suitcase, David." He scoffed, shaking his head. "No, Mom. It's not just a suitcase. It's embarrassing. You're embarrassing. Why can't you just buy a new bag like a normal person?" Caroline snickered and added, "Maybe we should just buy her one, so people don't think she wandered in off a bus station." I felt my cheeks burn. My eyes stung, but I refused to let the tears fall. Not in front of them. Not when my own family had chosen to humiliate me like strangers. So I did what I've always done. I stayed quiet. I gripped that old suitcase and followed them toward the check-in desk. But inside, something was shifting. For years, I had let these moments pass, telling myself, family was family, and you endure for their sake. But deep down, I knew this was going to be different. This wasn't just another mocking remark. This was a turning point, and I promised myself. It would also be the last time my son ever mocked me without consequence. As I stood there in that bustling airport, clutching my suitcase while strangers' eyes lingered a little too long, I realized this wasn't a new feeling. This moment, this sting of humiliation wasn't born in an instant. It was the culmination of years, maybe decades, of small cutting dismissals that I had quietly tucked away in my heart. You see, David had changed long ago. He wasn't always this cold, this dismissive. When he was a little boy, he used to cling to my skirt and cry if I left the room. He would draw me little pictures, proudly showing me his stick figures and scribbles that always included me at the center. Back then, I was his world. I gave everything, my time, my energy, my health to make sure he had more than I ever did growing up. But somewhere along the way, as he grew older, I began to notice a shift. At first it was subtle. eye rolls when I asked too many questions, a sharp tone when I reminded him to wear a jacket. I thought it was just teenage rebellion, that familiar awkward stage between boyhood and manhood. I told myself he'd grow out of it. He didn't. I remember the first time he embarrassed me in front of others. He must have been 23, freshly graduated, and I had joined him for dinner with some of his colleagues. I wanted to celebrate him, to show him how proud I was. I wore my best blouse, pressed carefully, and a pearl brooch Walter had once gifted me. As we sat down, David leaned over and muttered under his breath, "Couldn't you have worn something a little less old?" His words hit me like a slap. His friends laughed lightly, trying to brush it off, but I felt the heat rising in my cheeks. That night, I smiled and stayed quiet. But inside, something cracked. Then came the years of birthdays forgotten or brushed aside. One year, he sent a simple text. No call, no visit. The following year, he didn't say anything at all until Caroline reminded him the next day. I baked cakes for his children's birthdays, wrapped their gifts with care. But when my own special day arrived, it was barely a footnote. "You don't need all that fuss, Mom," he would say dismissively, handing me a card with nothing inside but his hurried signature. Yet for his wife's mother, there were dinners, balloons, even trips. The comparisons stung. It was as though my worth had quietly diminished, while others had taken my place on the pedestal I once held. Even the little things spoke volumes. When I visited their home, I was always assigned the smallest guest room. It had no windows, just a fold-out bed and a lamp that flickered when you turned it on. Meanwhile, Caroline's parents were given the master suite, king-sized bed, ensuite bathroom, fresh flowers on the nightstand. I never complained, but each time I laid on that creaky bed, I felt the weight of displacement. I wasn't their guest of honor. I was an afterthought, and David never missed a chance to jab at me in public. He mocked the way I struggled with my phone, calling me technologically hopeless. At Christmas dinner, when I brought my old family recipes, he scoffed that no one wanted outdated food when there was catered cuisine on the table. Even the grandkids picked up on it, repeating his jokes in their innocent voices, unaware of the harm. But the deepest wound came one summer evening when I overheard him speaking to Caroline in the kitchen. He didn't know I was in the hallway. He said, "Sometimes I think Mom's just in the way. She doesn't really add anything. She's more like a burden we have to manage." I stood there frozen, my breath caught in my throat, a burden. That's what my life had been reduced to in his eyes. Not the woman who carried him through sleepless nights, who patched scraped knees, who worked extra shifts to put food on the table, just a burden. From that night on, I stopped expecting warmth. I stopped expecting him to look at me with gratitude. I told myself I would be content with whatever scraps of kindness he chose to offer. But when he mocked me at the airport, so loudly, so cruelly, with strangers watching, it was different. It wasn't just another careless remark, it was an open declaration that I no longer deserved respect, not even the bare minimum. And standing there, I felt something inside me harden. I wasn't going to let it slide this time. I wasn't going to swallow my pain and smile. Not anymore. Little did David know, the suitcase he ridiculed was about to change everything. The line at the check-in desk seemed endless that morning. Families bustled about with their shiny new luggage, sleek rolling cases that glided effortlessly across the polished floors. And then there was me, clutching my old leather suitcase like it was an anchor in a storm. David's voice cut through the hum of travelers like a blade. "Mom, can't you walk faster? That thing squeaks every time you drag it." His words weren't hushed, not even softened for courtesy. No. He said it loud enough for the people ahead of us to glance back with amused smirks. I slowed my steps, hoping to shrink away from the attention. But David wasn't done. "I swear, Caroline, she's stuck in the Stone Age. Who even uses a suitcase without wheels anymore?" Caroline laughed, her manicured hand resting lightly on his arm. It's kind of cute in a pathetic way. The children snickered, pairing their parents. Grandma's got the dinosaur bag. The laughter that followed didn't just sting. It hollowed me out. I could feel the judgment of strangers, the weight of eyes flicking between me and the suitcase, like I was some comedy act meant to break up the monotony of travel. I wanted to shout, to tell them that this old case had traveled more of the world than they ever would, that it had carried my husband's shirts when we went to Paris for our anniversary, that it had held the first baby clothes I bought for David himself. But the words lodged in my throat. I knew they wouldn't listen. So instead, I breathed deeply and remembered Walter's voice. He had a way of speaking that was calm but commanding, even when life tested us. "Martha, dignity isn't about what others say to you. It's about how you carry yourself when they say it." I straightened my shoulders. I kept my lips pressed tight, my silence louder than their mockery. But inside, a fire began to kindle. When we finally reached the desk, the airline attendant gave me a kind smile. But I caught the flicker of pity in her eyes as she glanced at my suitcase. That pity was worse than mockery. It was like I was invisible, diminished, something fragile. David leaned on the counter with a practiced arrogance, speaking over me. "We're all together. Ignore the bag. She's old-fashioned." He chuckled, jerking his thumb toward me as though I wasn't standing right there. I clenched the handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. My dignity wasn't a punchline. Not anymore. The attendant's smile faltered, but she remained professional. "Of course, sir." But she looked back at her screen, then at me, then back at her screen again. "Actually, Mrs. Green, would you mind stepping aside for just a moment? Someone from our staff will be with you shortly." David frowned. "Why? Did she do something wrong?" He laughed almost triumphantly. "Probably because of that antique bag. Maybe they think it's suspicious." Caroline stifled another laugh, whispering to him, "See, I told you." But I noticed something they didn't. The attendant's eyes held respect, not suspicion. She gave me the smallest reassuring nod, almost like a secret between us. That was the moment I decided. I wouldn't let David's laughter be the closing chapter of this day. I would hold myself steady, let the story unfold, and watch as his arrogance crumbled under its own weight. As we moved toward the gate, David continued his tirade. "Mom, you have to stop clinging to the past. It's just a suitcase. Throw it out, buy a new one, and stop embarrassing us." I finally spoke, my voice quiet but firm. "It's more than a suitcase, David." He rolled his eyes. "No, it's not." "It's junk," Caroline added. "Honestly, people are staring. Don't you care about how this makes us look?" I turned to face them, my gaze steady. "I care about many things, Caroline. Respect, kindness, gratitude, appearances, not so much." My son groaned dramatically, waving his hand dismissively. "Whatever. Just stay close so you don't get lost." But deep down, I knew who was truly lost, and it wasn't me. I noticed the security staff watching discreetly, their radios buzzing as they glanced in my direction. David didn't see it. He was too busy basking in his own mockery. He had no idea the balance of power was about to shift. I kept walking, each step firmer than the last, the old suitcase squeaking softly behind me like a loyal companion. For the first time in years, I didn't feel ashamed of it. I felt proud. It wasn't a relic. It was a reminder of love, of endurance, of all the sacrifices no one seemed to remember. And as the gate loomed ahead, I whispered to myself, almost like a vow, "This ends today." We had just reached the gate when it happened. The loudspeaker crackled overhead, a calm but firm voice filling the terminal. "Mrs. Martha Green, please approach gate 12, Mrs. Martha Green." My heart gave a little jolt. Hearing your full name called out in an airport always makes you feel exposed, like a spotlight has landed on you. David groaned immediately. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Mom, what did you do now?" His voice carried, sharp and laced with irritation. People glanced our way again, as if waiting for the next act of the comedy show. I swallowed, my throat dry. I don't know. Probably something with that suitcase," Caroline muttered with a smirk. "Maybe they think it's a security risk." The children giggled, whispering about how Grandma's bag is suspicious. Before I could respond, two unformed security officers walked directly toward me. Their navy blazers and badges caught the fluorescent light, and the crowd parted instinctively. The sound of their shoes against the polished floor echoed like a drumbeat. I gripped the handle of my suitcase a little tighter. Every eye was on me now. "Mrs. Green?" one of the officers asked politely, stopping in front of me. "Yes," I said. My voice soft but steady. He smiled warmly. "Would you please come with us?" David immediately stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment. "Wait, what's this about? She didn't do anything wrong. She's old, and she doesn't always understand how things work." He laughed nervously, trying to mask his unease. The officer's expression didn't waver. "It's nothing to worry about, sir. We simply need to speak with Mrs. Green." David threw his hands in the air. "Unbelievable. Mom? This is exactly what I was talking about. You make everything difficult. Why can't you just be normal?" His words sliced deeper than he realized, but I kept my eyes on the officers. Something in their demeanor told me this wasn't trouble. This was something else entirely. I nodded quietly and followed them, my suitcase squeaking faithfully behind me. David trailed a few steps, muttering under his breath, while Caroline tried to hush the children who were still giggling. The walk wasn't far, but every step felt monumental. Travelers turned their heads as I passed, some whispering, others watching with open curiosity. I could feel David's panic rising behind me, his mutters turning into sharp whispers. "This is humiliating, Mom. Do you understand that? Everyone's staring at us because of you. Always because of you." I ignored him. For once, his words didn't pierce. They slid off me like raindrops. We stopped in front of a sleek frosted glass door near the boarding gate. One of the officers swiped his badge and the door opened with a quiet click. "Right this way, Mrs. Green," he said, holding it open for me. David tried to follow, but the other officer raised a hand. "I'm sorry, sir. Just Mrs. Green." David's mouth fell open. "What? Why?" The officer's polite smile remained. "This is a private matter." Caroline tugged at his sleeve, whispering urgently, but David's face had already drained of color. I'd never seen him so pale, so uncertain. He looked between me and the officers, his mouth working soundlessly, as if he couldn't decide whether to shout or shrink into silence. I adjusted the strap of my purse and looked back at him. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small beneath his judgment. I felt tall, steady, and strangely calm. "I'll see you on the plane," I said quietly. His lips parted, but no words came. Inside, the lounge was hushed and serene. Plush chairs, soft lighting, and the faint scent of fresh flowers filled the air. The officer gestured toward a concierge desk where a woman in a tailored suit stood waiting. "Mrs. Green," she said warmly, "we're honored to have you with us today. Right this way, please." My son's words still echoed faintly in my head. "You're embarrassing. You're in the way. You're a burden." But here in this quiet sanctuary, I felt the exact opposite. I was valued, I was seen, and I couldn't help but think. David had no idea what was coming next. The woman at the concierge desk smiled at me as though I were an old friend. "Mrs. Green, your husband's service record still holds a special place with our airline. We're pleased to extend our first-class hospitality to you today." Her words made my breath hitch. Walter. Even after all these years, even after he was gone, his name still opened doors. He had worked for the airline for nearly 30 years, loyal and steadfast. The kind of man who believed in doing his job with pride. When he passed, I thought his legacy had faded with him. But clearly, it hadn't. The woman gestured gracefully. "Right this way. We've upgraded your ticket. Please make yourself comfortable." I followed her down the hushed hallway, my old suitcase rolling awkwardly across the plush carpet. I felt a twinge of self-consciousness. Here were people with sleek designer luggage sipping champagne dressed in polished suits. And then there was me in my worn cardigan and sensible shoes, clutching a case that had long since lost its shine. But instead of laughter or smirks, I received something I hadn't expected. Respect. A young attendant rushed forward to take my bag. "Allow me, Mom. That's a beautiful piece. Real leather, isn't it?" I blinked. Beautiful. No one had called it that in years. "Yes," I murmured, my voice catching. "It's been with me a long time." He smiled. "They don't make them like this anymore. It's got character." I nearly laughed, the irony pressing at my chest. What my son had mocked relentlessly, what had made me the subject of public humiliation, was now being praised, and not in the patronizing way David often did things, but sincerely, warmly. The lounge itself was an oasis. Plush seating areas, soft lamps casting golden light, walls lined with books and art. It was quiet, serene, a world away from the chaos of the terminal. A waiter offered me a glass of champagne on a silver tray, and I accepted it with trembling hands. I sat down, sinking into a leather armchair that felt as though it was built just for me. The old suitcase rested beside me like a loyal friend, its scuffed edges suddenly not a mark of shame, but of survival. As I sipped the champagne, memories flooded back. Walter and I, young and newly married, boarding our first flight together. He had insisted on buying me that suitcase, saying, "If we're going to travel the world, you need something strong enough to keep up with us." And it had. It had carried my dresses to Paris, his overcoats to Rome, our guidebooks to little mountain villages in Switzerland. It had held baby blankets when David was born, and later his school projects when we visited relatives. Every crease, every scar in the leather was a reminder of a life fully lived, of love that had carried me through. I ran my hand over it gently, whispering, "Thank you, Walter." Because in that moment, I realized it wasn't just the airline that had remembered his service. It was him still watching over me somehow, still making sure I had dignity, even when others tried to strip it away. When boarding time came, I was escorted ahead of the crowd. The staff treated me like a guest of honor, guiding me down the jet bridge with quiet courtesy. And then there it was, my first-class seat. Wide leather cushions, a personal screen, space to stretch my legs, a blanket folded neatly on the armrest. The attendant placed my suitcase gently in the overhead compartment, her movements careful, respectful, almost reverent. "Anything you need, Mrs. Green?" she said warmly. "Please don't hesitate to ask." I sat down, my hands folded neatly in my lap, trying to process the sharp contrast. Just minutes earlier, I had been ridiculed like a child in public. Now I was sitting in a seat meant for executives, celebrities, people with wealth and power. And I hadn't demanded it. I hadn't begged for it. It had simply come to me quietly, like justice delivered on silver wings. I couldn't stop the smile that crept across my lips. Not smug, not gloating, just steady, calm, knowing, because I knew that in just a few minutes when David and his family boarded the plane, they would have to walk past me, past the old suitcase, past the mother they mocked, and for the first time they would see me not as a burden, not as a punchline, but as someone they could never diminish. The cabin door opened, and soon enough the steady stream of passengers began filing down the aisle. I smoothed my cardigan, folded my hands neatly in my lap, and waited. My old suitcase rested in the overhead bin above me, not hidden away in shame, but placed carefully where it belonged. I didn't have to wait long. David appeared, followed closely by Caroline and the children. They shuffled forward with the crowd toward economy, their carry-ons bumping into knees and elbows as they tried to maneuver through the narrow aisle. His voice carried loud and brash, as it always did when he felt the need to prove himself. "Watch your step, kids. Don't trip like your grandma with her antique suitcase." And then his eyes landed on me. For the briefest second, he froze. His steps faltered, his face drained of color. There I was, sitting in the wide, luxurious seat of first class. A folded blanket rested on my lap, a glass of water on the tray beside me. A stewardess stood nearby, checking in with me politely. I might as well have been a queen on a throne, and David, the man who had mocked me moments earlier, looked like a child caught misbehaving in church. Caroline's eyes widened and she clutched his arm. "David," she whispered, her voice tense, sharp with disbelief. The children, too young to fully understand, blinked at me in confusion. "Grandma, why are you sitting here?" I smiled softly. Not gloating, not flaunting, just steady. "Because this is my seat, sweetheart." David's mouth opened, then closed. He stammered, searching for words, his arrogance evaporating into thin air. Around him, other passengers craned their necks, whispering to one another. They had heard his jokes in the terminal, his mocking tone. Now they saw the reversal, the so-called burden sitting in first class while he shuffled past to the cramped quarters of economy. His pale face said it all. The stewardess gestured politely. "Please continue to your seats, sir. We'll be closing the overhead bins shortly." David hesitated, glaring at me as though I'd betrayed him, though I had done nothing but sit where I was welcomed. Caroline tugged at his sleeve again, urging him forward. Finally he moved, his jaw tight, his children trailing behind. As they passed, I caught the faint hiss of Caroline's whisper. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? People are staring." David muttered something back, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He sounded small, diminished. I turned my gaze out the window, but inside I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Vindication. Not because I was in a cushioned seat or sipping from a glass instead of a paper cup, but because the truth had revealed itself in silence. My dignity, long buried under his mockery, had risen again. Throughout the flight, I caught glimpses of him when he shuffled past to use the restroom. He couldn't meet my eyes. His usual swagger had vanished, replaced with an awkward stiffness. Caroline avoided looking at me altogether, her lips pressed in a tight line. But the children, they didn't carry the same weight of pride. One of them slipped up to me quietly at one point, peeking into first class with wide eyes. "Grandma," my granddaughter whispered, "your seat looks so nice. Do they give you snacks too?" I chuckled softly, patting her hand. "Yes, darling, they do." I offered her one of the shortbread cookies the attendant had placed on my tray. She grinned, thanked me, and hurried back to her parents. That small moment warmed me. It reminded me that not all respect is lost forever. It can be relearned, rekindled, passed down, if only someone is willing to set the example. By the time the plane settled into its smooth rhythm across the clouds, the humiliation had shifted. No longer was I the butt of jokes. No longer was my suitcase the center of mockery. Instead, the shame sat heavily on David's shoulders, visible in the way he avoided conversation, in the restless tapping of his fingers against the armrest. And I sat in quiet comfort, sipping my tea, remembering Walter's words. Dignity isn't about what others give you, it's about what you never let them take away. David had tried to strip me of it for years, but in that moment, watching him pale and unsettled, I knew something had changed. The power had shifted, not through shouting, not through anger, but through the simple act of being seen for who I truly was. And David, my son, who once thought me a burden, had no choice but to face it. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady lullaby in the background. I leaned back in my wide leather seat, a warm blanket draped across my lap, and closed my eyes for a moment. Around me, the first-class cabin felt like another world. Soft voices, gentle service, the clink of glass instead of the crinkle of plastic. But my mind wasn't on the luxury. It was on the years leading up to this moment. I thought about every birthday David had forgotten, every sarcastic remark he'd made about my clothes, my recipes, my very presence. I thought about the way I'd been shunted aside in his home, as if I were furniture to be tucked away. Each of those small humiliations had carved a hollow space inside me. For years, I had filled that hollow with excuses. He's busy. He doesn't mean it. Maybe he'll change. But sitting there, cradled in dignity that was mine by right, I realized something. The problem wasn't that David had changed. The problem was that I had allowed him to. I had let his words weigh more than my own, and I promised myself then, at 30,000 feet, that I would never let that happen again. The stewardess approached with a pot of tea. "Mrs. Green, would you like another cup?" "Yes, thank you," I said softly. She poured, her movements careful, respectful. As she set the cup down, she added with a smile, "Your suitcase is lovely, by the way. My grandmother had one almost like it. Things made back then were built to last." I smiled, warmth blooming in my chest. Yes, they were. I thought of Walter again. I could almost hear his voice, see his gentle smile as he handed me that suitcase decades ago. He'd known me, respected me, cherished me, and though he was gone, his love still wrapped around me like a shield. That old suitcase wasn't just leather and brass. It was proof that someone once upon a time had believed I was worth giving the very best, and that was something David's scorn could never erase. The hours passed, the cabin dimming as passengers settled into sleep. I remained awake, staring out at the endless stretch of clouds beneath us. Somewhere back in economy, David sat stiff and silent, his pride crumbling in the quiet, and I didn't feel anger. Not anymore. I felt peace. When the plane touched down, the usual chaos erupted. Passengers rushing to grab bags, children crying, people shuffling impatiently toward the exit. But in first class, the pace was slower, gentler. The attendant brought down my suitcase carefully, handing it to me with both hands. "Here you go, Mom. She's still sturdy as ever." I nodded gratefully. "Thank you." As I stepped off the plane, I felt the weight of eyes on me again, not mocking this time, curious, respectful. A few of the passengers who had overheard David's mocking earlier now looked at me with something else in their expressions. Recognition, quiet approval. David and his family caught up with me at baggage claim. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Caroline's lips were pressed tight, her face pinched with irritation. The children looked between us, confused by the unspoken tension. I lifted my suitcase from the carousel, its leather still scratched, but gleaming under the harsh lights. I held it firmly by my side, my posture tall. David finally muttered, "So, first class, huh?" His voice was flat, almost resentful. "Yes," I replied calmly, "first class." I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The silence between us was enough. On the ride to the hotel, I stared out the window, the city rushing by in a blur. David tried to speak once or twice, starting sentences that trailed into nothing. Caroline scrolled on her phone. The children dozed in the back seat. I said nothing. For once, I didn't need to defend myself. My dignity had already spoken louder than any words could. That night, in my hotel room, I placed the suitcase by the bed and rested my hand on its handle. For the first time in years, I didn't see it as a relic of a past life. I saw it as a symbol, a reminder that respect isn't given freely, but neither can it be taken from someone who refuses to let it go. As I drifted to sleep, I smiled, not because I had humiliated my son, But because I had reclaimed something that was mine all along, and I knew that from this day forward, no matter what he said or did, David would never again look at me the same way. In the days that followed, David was quieter around me. He never brought up the suitcase again. He didn't apologize, not in words anyway, but there was a shift. The jokes stopped. The snide remarks faded. At family meals, he kept his voice measured when he spoke to me. It wasn't a transformation overnight, but it was something. Perhaps seeing me in first class, escorted with respect, while he stood pale and powerless, had planted a seed he couldn't ignore. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind him of his cruelty. I simply carried on, suitcase in hand, shoulders straight. The truth is that moment at the airport wasn't about punishing my son. It was about reclaiming something he'd been chipping away at for years, my dignity. And once I held it again, I realized I would never let it go. The old suitcase still sits by my bedside. Sometimes I run my fingers over its worn leather and remember Walter's words, his love, his belief that I deserved the best. And I smile because in the end, he was right. Respect isn't about shiny luggage or appearances or keeping up with the world. Respect is about how you carry yourself even when others try to tear you down. So to anyone listening, especially those who know the sting of being dismissed, mocked, or made small, I'll say this. Never let anyone take away your dignity. Even if all you have left is an old suitcase and a quiet smile, that may be enough to remind the world who you really are. And sometimes, just sometimes, the world listens.